Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateacherhistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateacherfist, or shoot me an email, chris@ateacherhistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, and welcome into A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me again today. Did you know that Martin Van Buren is the first president in American history that was born a U.S. citizen and the first to have English as his second language? And that one of the loudest opponents of President Martin Van Buren was Davy Crockett? And that President Andrew Jackson, in his farewell address as he was leaving office, warned that the political divisions that were forming between the North and the South could lead to violence in the battlefield. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will cover that and more in episode 130. Martin Van Buren cashes in. All right, everyone, welcome into episode 130. No book recommendation for this week, and we are just diving right into it. So, last week we wrapped up the presidency of Andrew Jackson. As you know, we spent a lot of time on Jackson, but I think it was worth it. Few presidents in American history impacted the office like he did, and love him or hate him, he was certainly worth going into great depth on. Martin Van Buren, well, not as much. But don't worry, no spoilers here. As we transition Andrew Jackson out of office, I took some time last week to update you on a couple things. America was still expanding its internal transportation and pumping funds into internal improvements. The U.S. was also expanding, adding 2 new states during Jackson's time in the White House, while also keeping a keen eye on the independent nation of Texas, which had recently won its freedom from Mexico. Abolitionists were starting to make some waves in the North and began to put pressure on Southern politicians to confront the atrocities of slavery and the social, economic, and political impacts it was having on our nation, both domestically and internationally. What did Southern congressmen do in response to this growing wave of abolition? Well, they banned any discussion of slavery through the gag rule. Andrew Jackson, along with Martin Van Buren, had drastically lowered voting requirements and brought a wave of quote-unquote democracy to America. Of course, I put democracy in air quotes because women and African Americans still could not vote. And, well, we're also technically a republic, not a democracy. Speaking of politics, though, there was a 2-party system again, with the Whigs creating an opposition party to Andrew Jackson and coalescing their efforts around the distinct objective of rejecting the political changes that the Jacksonians, like Martin Van Buren, were going to continue to bring to the United States. But the lingering impact that Jackson's presidency will have on the subsequent years in America and will be most acutely felt was in his decision to defund and then destroy the Bank of the United States. And this is something that Martin Van Buren is unfortunately going to left holding the bag for, and it will not work out too well for him. And we'll cover that in a future episode. So who exactly is this Martin Van Buren guy? We've been talking about him for a couple months now. We've been mentioning him here and there. Well, while he is the only president to have his own street gang, and you can check that out in Seinfeld, Season 8, Episode 14, to learn more about the Van Buren boys, most people don't really know anything about Martin Van Buren. And he's usually toward the top of that list that everyone has and most commonly forgotten presidents. Like, oh yeah, I forgot that guy was president. Just like Ben Franklin and Alexander Hamilton are tops of the list of guys that people thought were presidents that weren't. But Martin Van Buren is worth remembering. Yes, he only served one term as president, and it wasn't a successful one, something we'll dive into more detail about in a future episode, but he nonetheless was really impactful to American politics. Martin Van Buren was a skilled politician, someone who was able to earn, and rightfully so, the trust of Andrew Jackson and others. His nicknames were the Little Magician, is one of them, which was drawn from a quote of Andrew Jackson in which he noted that, quote, "It is said that Martin Van Buren is a great magician. I believe it. But his only wand is good common sense, which he uses for the benefit of the country." Another one of Martin Van Buren's nicknames was the Sly Fox, for like how sly and sneaky and stealthy of a politician he was. But Martin Van Buren worked to back up these nicknames. He was regarded by many as the best politician in the state of New York and an absolute master at backroom politics. If there was a deal to be made, Martin Van Buren was going to be able to figure out a way to make it. Van Buren was born in 1782 in Kinderhook, New York, a little Dutch community, and was actually the first president to be born a U.S. citizen, which makes sense, but something I never really think about since he was the first president to be born after the Revolution. Oh, and he was also the first president to have English as his second language. His first language was Dutch, seeing as how he was born in a small Dutch town in New York. I can't wait for the day, by the way, that I'm on Jeopardy and all of these useless U.S. history questions are their own topic, like, foods that begin with the letter Q. As a young man, Martin Van Buren spent a lot of his time at his father's tavern, where venerable politicians like Aaron Burr were frequent visitors. And okay, yeah, I know Burr was a murderer, but before all the whole murdering stuff, he could be considered venerable. Van Buren passed the bar, married, had 4 sons who lived to adulthood, and was a widow by 1819, with his wife Hannah dying of tuberculosis. In order to help support his legal career and his aspiring political career, Van Buren moved to Hudson, New York, and it proved to be a great decision. By 1812, Van Buren was elected to the New York State Senate, and by 1815, he was elected to the position of Attorney General. Clearly, he was a guy who knew what he was doing. He eventually moved to Albany, New York, and continued to hold the simultaneous roles of Attorney General and State Senator. Van Buren was proving himself to be a master politician, and when his political rival, George Clinton, was elected governor of New York in 1817, Martin Van Buren led the opposition, a group known as the Albany Regency, which had the backing of both the small farmers and the political machine Tammany Hall in New York City. Van Buren led a referendum through the state legislature to expand voting rights in New York, giving Tammany Hall, and in turn himself, indirectly, even more leverage and power in local politics. Having experienced such a rapid rise in popularity in state politics, Martin Van Buren turned his attention to national politics. Martin Van Buren was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1821 and eventually tried to engineer a William Crawford victory in the presidential election of 1824, which I spoke about briefly in episode 114. After seeing his plan fall apart, and Henry Clay help engineer a victory for John Quincy Adams, Martin Van Buren stayed out of the spotlight and began scheming for the 1828 election. As a member of the Senate, Van Buren recognized that this era of good feelings was coming to an end, and he was more than happy to see it. Martin Van Buren, deep in his heart, was a states' rights Jeffersonian, and he was frustrated by the way that he believed the national government was morphing into a more Hamiltonian form of national and federal authority. Van Buren liked the two-party system that George Washington had warned about and believed it was best for the nation to present 2 different national political platforms. That way the U.S. could avoid being split apart and in regional and sectional differences like it was in 1824, with John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, Andrew Jackson, and William Crawford all thriving in different regions or sections of the country. While Martin Van Buren didn't love Andrew Jackson, he recognized that he was certainly the best bet to beat Adams in 1828, and he threw his support behind the popular general. In order to help Jackson and increase his own security in New York, Martin Van Buren pushed through the Tariff of Abominations in 1828, knowing it would benefit his home state of New York and help with his own local popularity. On top of that, Van Buren wasn't too worried about the political impact it would have on Jackson. He knew the South was never going to vote for John Quincy Adams, no matter how bad the tariff was, and he knew that New England was never going to vote for Jackson, no matter how good it was. So, locking down a state like New York was crucial. And for some of you out there wondering, no, New York is not part of New England. Martin Van Buren wanted to do whatever he could to ride the coattails of Jackson's popularity, which is a sound political strategy. And when he ran for governor of New York, he did just that, under the official political party of Jacksonian Democrat. He cruised to victory as governor of New York and bided his time there just for really like a month and a half, until he got the call to join President Jackson's cabinet, which he did as Secretary of State. In his time as Secretary of State, Van Buren emerged as a valuable advisor to President Jackson and really got into his good graces during the whole petticoat or Peggy Eaton affair. After the drama calmed down and Jackson dissolved his cabinet, Martin Van Buren was given an appointment of ambassador to Britain, something I mentioned a few episodes ago, which was blocked in the Senate by John C. Calhoun, who at the time was currently the vice president and had the tie-breaking vote. Calhoun was ecstatic at his political maneuvering, declaring that this would crush Van Buren's political career, reveling that, quote, "It will kill him dead. He will never kick, sir, never kick." Unfortunately for Calhoun, who, remember, was at odds with Jackson at the time over nullification, this backfired. Martin Van Buren looked like the victim of a stupid petty fight between Jackson and Calhoun. It raised the political profile and endeared Van Buren even more to a man who loved to fight, like Andrew Jackson. Martin Van Buren, as you know, eventually became Jackson's VP, and the Democratic Party was born. Van Buren helped counsel Jackson into a peaceful ending to the nullification crisis, advised him on his war with the bank, and tried to mend various political relationships that had been damaged by Jackson's outrageous personality. With the election of 1836 approaching, it was now Martin Van Buren's turn to cash in on all of this career capital that he had spent the last 20 years building up. As President Jackson prepared to leave the White House, he was pretty relieved to be moving on in his life. Jackson was pretty old by this point, especially for early 19th century standards, approaching his 70th birthday. He had participated in the Revolutionary War, was a hero of the War of 1812, the most controversial president in American history up to this point, and I think we can all agree he had left his mark. One of the reasons he was relieved to be moving on was that he had handpicked his successor, someone that he trusted implicitly in Martin Van Buren. Van Buren had promised to carry on the Jacksonian mission, and with that, he easily won over the support of the Jacksonian Democrats. Martin Van Buren, reflecting on the political opportunity staring him right in the face, commented that he was lucky to have the opportunity to, quote, "tread generally in the footsteps of General Jackson. Happy if I shall be able to perfect the work that he has so gloriously begun." And that is exactly how he wanted to present himself in the election of 1836. Van Buren found himself in an enviable position. He was following a very popular outgoing president, and just like his election as governor of New York, he planned on riding Jackson's coattails right into the White House. Just like in the election of 1832, the anti-Masons and nullifiers went through the seemingly arbitrary motions of presenting candidates for president and VP, but the real competition, as you could have guessed, was going to come from the Whigs. And this is where I think Van Buren deserves a lot of credit. Many will say that without Andrew Jackson, there would be no Van Buren presidency, and look, maybe that is true. But Martin Van Buren was the one who spent all the time behind the scenes building a national brand for the Democratic Party and a unified platform for its mission. I mean, he didn't pick up the nicknames Lil Magician and Sly Fox for no reason. And all of this work behind the scenes paid off big time. Because by 1836, the Whigs still had not been able to do this, right? Build a national brand and create a unified platform with one candidate running. Because once again, in 1836, the Whigs made the same mistake. They were split between 4 different candidates: William Henry Harrison, Daniel Webster, Hugh White, and Willie Mangrum. While Harrison and White were the 2 primary candidates on the ballots in the North and the South respectively, their division only further hurt them. The Whigs were hoping they'd be able to regionalize their candidates to get enough votes in each state to prevent Martin Van Buren from winning that state, thus preventing him from winning the majority of electoral votes. But with Martin Van Buren eking out a popular vote victory in Pennsylvania by only 4,000 votes, the Whig plan fell apart, and Van Buren secured a majority of the electors. Which, by the way, it probably didn't matter, as even if the vote had gone to the House like it did in 1824, it was still a majority Jacksonian Democrat and likely would have elected Martin Van Buren anyway. With Martin Van Buren as the official president-elect, Jackson could take a deep breath with the knowledge that Martin Van Buren would carry his torch and that Jackson's popularity helped him get elected. Jackson, I'm sure, was pleased with the current state of American politics. But look, Van Buren wasn't Andrew Jackson. While the two were very close personally and professionally, it was hard to find 2 men that were more different than these two. Davy Crockett, yes, that's Davy Crockett, once remarked that, quote, Van Buren is as opposite to Andrew Jackson as dung is to a diamond. He is what the English call a dandy. He struts and swaggers like a crow in the gutter. And everyone pretty much knew this. Martin Van Buren was a fine wine kind of guy. He wore super nice velvety clothes, and some even accused him of wearing perfume. So he wasn't very similar to former General Andrew Jackson, who was walking around with a freaking bullet still lodged in his chest from a duel decades earlier. In addition to this, and something we will see play out in his presidency, Van Buren did not carry the confidence in his convictions like Jackson did. Van Buren was a political animal, always waffling back and forth, trying best to play both sides. Famously, someone tried to get Martin Van Buren to take a stance on the sun rising in the east, and Van Buren, true to form, refused to be pinned down. He said, quote, well, Senator, I understand that is the common acceptance, but as I never get up before dawn, I can't really say. And it's comments like this that help me understand why he was a successful lawyer, too. And being so different than Andrew Jackson will prove to be a political challenge for Van Buren. But, of course, that's not going to be the only thing that will be tough for him. Because one of the things that makes it so hard in following a guy like Jackson is that while you get his raving fans, you also get his hated enemies, and he had a lot of them. As I mentioned last episode, one of the primary reasons the Whigs were able to rise to power as quickly as they were was because of the different factions of people that Jackson had at one time alienated himself from or turned off. And I think this would be a time to once again mention a very famous American who was not a fan of Jackson or Van Buren, the aforementioned Davy Crockett. Crockett was a former member of the Tennessee Militia, the Tennessee General Assembly, and the House of Representatives. Initially, he was a supporter of the General Andrew Jackson, but Crockett voted against Indian removal in 1830, costing him his bid at re-election in the House in 1831. He moved to another district, was elected to the House again, and began to catch the eye of the Whig Party. Here's a guy from Tennessee who was rough and ready, bear hunter, who the people liked, who was willing to stand up to the president. Doesn't come around often. With urgent support and some not-so-subtle hints that he could be in line for an even bigger role in politics one day, like the presidency, Crockett decided to spend much of his term promoting himself. Collaborating with a fellow congressman to write his autobiography, a narrative of the life of David Crockett written by himself, Davy went east to promote his book. When he returned back to Tennessee, he realized that even with his new nationwide fame, he may not be able to secure re-election in his own district. And to that, he famously said, quote, "I told the people of my district that I would serve them as faithfully as I had done. But if not, they might go to hell, and I would go to Texas." And that he did. This isn't the last we'll hear of Davy Crockett. And with his death at the Alamo, his legend just continued to grow. Speaking of Texas, that was one issue that Jackson regretted not having more clarity about when he handed over the reins to Van Buren. Jackson had hoped he could get some closure on the whole Texas question, but it was not to be. Van Buren would have to face it head on and figure out how he wanted to handle it. And this is where we'll leave off today. Martin Van Buren has won the presidential election of 1836 and will be entering office as the 8th president, trying to handle an economy that is falling apart, a nation that is divided, and a very big question in Texas that needed to be answered. Now, most U.S. history books continue the narrative of the expansion of democracy and move on with Van Buren's presidency and now into William Henry Harrison, briefly before he dies, and then John Tyler, who takes over for him, and then even a President Polk in the election of 1844, before circling back to westward expansion, the Texas Revolution, and the war with Mexico. But I understood why they did that, especially for students who are taking on so much content in such a short period of time, but I never really liked that division so much. Because the independent state, or nation of Texas, however you want to refer to it, is a really big deal. And it was a big deal at the end of Jackson's presidency and will be a divisive issue for the decade in between their independence and America's war with Mexico. I think it would be a disservice to continue our narrative in the way the textbooks normally do. And as much as I appreciate and respect the concept of chunking themes together, in this podcast we'll do things a bit differently. So right now we're going to, in episode 130, pause our chronological narrative here, following the election of 1836 and Van Buren's victory. We're going to take time now, moving forward, beginning with episode 131, to turn our attention to the Southwest and more closely examine what has been going on the last year or two in Texas. After we wrap up the Texas Revolution, we'll then return to the American scene post-1836 election. As you pack up your things, I'd like to take a moment to reflect on Andrew Jackson's last message to the nation prior to heading into retirement. And I know that last week I said we were finished with President Jackson. You're probably thinking, my goodness, how much more can we talk about this guy? But I think this address is worth covering briefly. As Jackson left the White House, he decided to take a page out of George Washington's book and write his own farewell address. Except with no Alexander Hamilton around, this one was actually mostly written by the outgoing president. Some in Jackson's circle thought it was a bit presumptuous of Andrew Jackson to write his own farewell address after the great George Washington, but he figured, what the hell, he's Andrew Jackson. Who cares what my aides think? Also, and I think this is warranted, Jackson had decades, literally, of experience all over the country in both the military and in politics, and he believed that he had something worth passing on. So, more power to him. But Jackson didn't do it totally on his own. Roger B. Taney, who had just been appointed the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court following John Marshall's death. Yeah, John Marshall had been Chief Justice for the past 34 years, by the way, if you were keeping track. Taney set aside his Supreme Court duties to help Jackson put the address together. In this farewell address, Jackson reflected back on almost 50 years of the United States under the Constitution, and he recounted the success America had had in its brief history, credited the Constitution for allowing this never-before-seen prosperity to befall such a young nation. And he covered a lot of stuff in this address. But what I find most fascinating about this speech to the nation was the warning that Jackson made for the future of the country. Like Washington, who warned the nation to avoid foreign entanglements and forming domestic political parties, claiming they would undermine what the nation had worked so hard for. Andrew Jackson had his own premonition. Jackson was afraid that the nation was becoming too divided on state and sectional interest, and that division was going to lead to violence sooner rather than later. So I want to wrap up this episode today by reading an excerpt from Andrew Jackson's farewell address. Quote, "But amid this general prosperity and splendid success, the dangers of which he warned us are becoming very evident every day, and the signs of evil are sufficiently apparent to awaken the deepest anxiety in the bosom of the patriot. We behold systematic efforts publicly made to sow the seeds of discord between the different parts of the United States and to place party divisions directly upon geographical distinctions, to excite the South against the North and the North against the South, and to force into the controversy the most delicate and exciting topics upon which it is impossible that a large portion of the Union can ever speak without strong emotion." And on a side note, he's talking about slavery here. "Appeals, too, are constantly made to sectional interest in order to influence the election of the chief magistrate, as if it were desired that he should favor a particular quarter of the country instead of fulfilling the duties of his station with impartial justice to all." And there he's referring to the Whigs breaking up their presidential candidates for different sections of the country. "And the impossible dissolution of the Union has at length become an ordinary and familiar subject of discussion." And there he's referring to the nullifiers. "Has the warning voice of Washington been forgotten, or have designs already been formed to sever the Union? Let it not be supposed that I impute to all of those who have taken an active part in these unwise and unprofitable discussions a want of patriotism or of public virtue. The honorable feeling of state pride and local attachment finds a place in the bosoms of the most enlightened and pure. But while such men are conscious of their own integrity and honesty of purpose, they ought never to forget that the citizens of other states are their political brethren, and that however mistaken they may be in their views, the great body of them are equally honest and upright with themselves. Mutual suspicions and reproaches may in time create mutual hostility, and artful and designing men will always be found who are ready to foment these fatal divisions and to inflame the natural jealousies of different sections of the country. The history of the world is full of such examples, and especially the history of republics. What have you to gain by division and dissension? Delude not yourselves with the belief that a breach once made may be afterwards repaired. If the Union is once severed, the line of separation will grow wider and wider, and the controversies, which are now debated and settled in the halls of legislation, will then be tried in fields of battle and determined by the sword. And as a side note here, I'm sort of just riffing right now. As I sit here in June of 2020, and you may be listening to this now in July of 2020 or maybe 2030, I think it's important that we take Andrew Jackson's advice. And while maybe he isn't the best person to be giving this advice, it really hit me as I was reading this again. We ought never to forget that the citizens of other states, citizens who belong to other political parties or live in other regions of the country, they are our political brethren. We are all brothers and sisters within the United States of America, and we have far more in common than we do different. And just like Jackson pointed out, there will always be people in this nation, seemingly good and forthright people, who are all too willing and too excited to sow division between us, turning Americans against each other. But I would encourage you not to fall for that type of rhetoric and not to get involved in that type of rhetoric. In the end, we're all looking for the same thing: to live in a country that we love and that protects our rights and freedoms and helps us live the life that we always dreamed of. And the more we can have conversations about how to do that, and the less we can have conversations about how others are preventing us from doing that, the better we will be. And by learning about history and learning about Jackson and Van Buren and Jefferson and soon to be Lincoln, right? And Teddy Roosevelt and all the women, great women that we will talk about, and African-American men and women we will talk about, we'll gain an empathy and understanding. In the end, we're all just trying to achieve the same thing. Thanks for listening. And hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.